Hello and welcome to the Make It Conscious podcast. This is episode 3, and the title of this episode is Individuation is a Way of Life. Now, we're going to be looking at today what modern psychology misses when it comes to the essential process of spiritual growth. And if you remember in the previous episode, we looked at what religion misses, and in the episode prior to that, the first episode, we looked at what materialism and materialist society misses about spiritual growth. So I discussed in those episodes how humanity has come from a place where we had a lot of perceived certainty in the form of religion, and how that really allowed us to engage with our unconscious mind and played an essential role in doing that. But as we've become more rational in our thinking, especially since the Enlightenment in the late 1600s, we've come to rely more and more on rational thought, scientific thinking. In doing that, have dispelled some of the myths and illusions of religious thinking, but have also thrown out some of the realness which that represented, and have lost our ability to engage with the unconscious mind in a meaningful way, and in place set up fixed ideals, technology, scientific progress, but try to fix and patch up the world in such a way that we can protect ourselves permanently. But of course, we're trying to cover up here an inner uncertainty, and the problems of that shift from religiosity to materialism has created incalculable problems, which we see manifesting in a number of ways, and has directly led to the discovery of the unconscious mind. Now, people have been aware of the unconscious mind in various ways for who knows how long. Even Plato was talking about it. But the term the unconscious in a modern sense was really popularized by Freud, expanded upon by Jung, but it certainly wasn't invented by Freud. Even Schelling prior to him was talking about the unconscious mind. So we've come this far, and in today's session I want to talk about how the problems of this materialist view and modern psychology are now arising in the way we structure and live our lives, and what we can then actually do about it. So as part of that, I'm going to be highlighting the signs of how this appears, and I'm also going to be talking about, near the end, a modality for actually taking ourselves beyond this as individuals. And of course, spiritual growth is not something that anyone else can do for us. It's something we can only do on our own, calling on inspiration from others, integrating aspects of others into ourselves, calling on the help from others, sure, but ultimately it is a process of making the unconscious conscious. That is what spiritual growth is. That's the most concise way in which I've been able to summarize the process of spiritual growth and describe the mechanics of it, what it actually consists of. And that, of course, is also built on Jungian psychology and what he brought to the table. So as I said, this episode is called Individuation is a Way of Life. Just to kick us off today, I want to relay a quote from Jung. This, I think, is one of the most powerful and pertinent quotes from Jung, and that is saying something, because if you ever read his books, pretty much every paragraph contains Instagrammable quotes. Not that sharing them on Instagram seems to make much difference to the minds of people, but nonetheless, here is a particularly powerful one. Jung says, "We have not understood yet that the discovery of the unconscious means an enormous spiritual task which must be accomplished if we wish to preserve our civilization." So that quote pretty much encapsulates what this channel is about. There's really 3 key points being made in this quote here. Firstly, the discovery of the unconscious, and what a profound discovery that was. Because to the religious view, it's saying, hey, what you're doing is valuable, but let's not mistake the material point, the statue of Jesus, or the book itself, or your spiritual teacher, for the real thing, for the realness which they represent. what you're doing is you're engaging with aspects of yourself. And actually, we can go on further and say, well, maybe the whole idea that you exist as a separate self out there in the world is actually a bit fallacious. Maybe what you're experiencing is the self. And so we can shift to an idealist perspective here. And this discovery of the unconscious and an idealist paradigm, like the idea that it's not that our consciousness appears in the world, it's that actually the world appears in our consciousness, and that mind is the forerunner to matter. These ideas are kind of inseparable, really. When you really get deep into what the unconscious is, understand it not merely as memories and repressed feelings and this kind of thing, but more broadly, it is potential. It is what has the propensity to arise. And it only arises in consciousness. And you start thinking along those lines, you think, okay, maybe, this concept of the unconscious is not merely something we just bolt on to a materialist paradigm, but maybe it's actually the window to an idealist paradigm. Maybe that's actually the kind of lines we ought to be thinking along if we wish to solve our innumerable problems and neuroses that exist in our broken culture today. So there is that point about the discovery of the unconscious, and what that means is an enormous spiritual task. It's not just something you do at the weekends. It's not just something you tick off when you go and have a therapy session. It's not just something you do when you meet up with your spiritual group or friends. It is the process of making the unconscious conscious. And that's kind of what life is, right? Whether we realize it or not, that is what time appears to us as. That is what this whole experience is. It is the unconscious becoming conscious. So it's not something we can just partition off to an hour a week like we might do with meeting our coach or having a language lesson or something. It is our life. And it's happening whether we realize it or not. So we might as well make it a conscious process. And not only that, but actually it must be accomplished if we wish to preserve our civilization. Because all of our challenges can be construed as spiritual challenges. I made this point in the very first episode. Whether we're talking about aggression between countries, whether we're talking about a broken economic system, whether we're talking about even our physical health and chronic disease right now. Now, this is a spiritual challenge. It is on one level our lack of understanding around the unconscious mind and taking a materialist view of the world that most threatens our own well-being, the integrity of our organizations, and it's not an overstatement to say our society as a whole, not just its ability to facilitate our well-being, but its very existence is threatened by this misunderstanding or this lack of understanding of the psyche. Now, we can discuss any number of reasons as to why that is and why we don't understand the psyche. I'm not making any claims as to whether this is a set of conditions imposed on us or not. I tend to think that regardless of that, it always comes back to self-sovereignty, and that any individual can choose to move in the direction of understanding. And not only that, but that is what we see happening. It is a natural evolution of consciousness. And in the last episode, I talked about how we've moved through religion into materialism, and how actually, rather than materialism just being a trap and nothing but a trap, maybe it's actually a helpful phase. So a sort of temporary but necessary trap, if you like. A trap that when we break out of en masse, we will have learnt a great deal in between, and then we can actually integrate the opposites. We can actually take what we learned from that and combine that with an understanding of the unconscious mind and a willingness to engage with the deepest parts of ourselves. Because genuine spiritual growth has a place for both things, for rational thought and engagement with those deepest aspects of ourselves. Just to clarify some terms here then, so individuation, what does this actually mean? Well, the definition I use is that it is the process of growing beyond the ego, becoming whole, and discovering the true self. So the ego being essentially the small self. Some people think of this as the left brain. So this is sort of what we know, how we think about ourselves, and how we then extrapolate that into the various assumptions about ourselves and our expectations of the future and other people as well. Becoming whole means bringing on board all aspects of us and considering that who we are is not the ego. From our perspective, who we are is everything, right? There's nothing we experience that's outside of the self. But that also includes the unconscious mind and all of our potential and everything we have yet to learn, for example. So becoming whole means bringing on board all those aspects and discovering the true self in its entirety. And by virtue of that, that also means living in harmony with the world, living in alignment with it. Because it's through the world that we actually come to understand ourselves and make those unrealized aspects conscious. And so any misalignment from the world can actually point to aspects of ourselves and our own mind that are yet to be integrated. So this actually is the aim of every person. It's the will of the mind, it's the will of the psyche. It's also the goal of every religion, ostensibly, right? Talking about enlightenment, talking about getting to know God and becoming whole, like religions do talk about this. That is the process of individuation. They might not call it that. They might not even be aware that that's what they're doing. But this is the process. And so if you hear me talk about integration, integrating the mind, that's the same thing. It's individuation. Likewise, spiritual growth, making the unconscious conscious, becoming whole, becoming who we truly are or our true self, fulfilling our potential, eliminating conflict, and ego development. These are all more or less interchangeable terms for individuation. So even though you might not have heard the word individuation before, perhaps you have, perhaps you haven't, but these terms are all pretty much pointing to the same thing. In the words of Clement of Alexandria, he says, "The most excellent and important among all forms of knowledge is therefore self-knowledge. For if one knows himself, he can also know God." In the last episode, I talked about God, and I talked about how God can also be thought of as representing our full potential. And so on some level, God is an idea, and it's an aspiration that we move towards. And how if we're not actually moving towards our full potential, then what are we moving towards? Something egoic, something based out of wanting to fix and cajole the world into being a certain way, which can only be desirable as a way to placate an inner conflict that we're otherwise not looking to resolve. There's only so long that can last before it inevitably shows up and comes back to bite us in some way. Now, just to say a bit about Carl Jung, you'll hear me talking about Jung a lot, and whilst he was by no means the only individual who contributed to our psycho-spiritual knowledge, he served a pretty prominent role during his life. He was born in 1875, died in 1961, and he built heavily upon the ideas of Freud and was indeed a student of Freud's for quite some time, but they disagreed over conceptions of the unconscious. So Freud's work was no doubt groundbreaking and quite misrepresented as well. But nonetheless, they disagreed insofar as Jung had a more holistic view of the unconscious and what it was, and that it didn't merely play a role in neuroses, but that actually it was involved in the fulfillment of our entire potential. And this ties in with a more spiritual outlook, which is that actually the unconscious is not merely a dustbin for the mind. It's actually something that can be thought of as full unrealized potential. So as much as Jung was a psychologist, he definitely had a spiritual bent and was, in my mind, one of the most prominent figures when it came to bridging the gap between psychology and spirituality. As I said recently, I don't think those two things are inherently that separable. And so whilst there's many attempts in physics, for example, to try and find the theory of everything, I'm doubtful as to whether we'll find it there. In fact, I don't think we'll ever find the theory of everything, because if it knew everything, it wouldn't be a theory. We'll certainly find a theory of everything. We can have many of those. But certainly if we're approaching this from more of an idealist perspective rather than a materialist perspective, any theory of everything is not going to be found in physics. It's going to be found in psychology. So Jung also coined the concepts of synchronicities, archetypes, the collective unconscious, individuation itself, and personality type. So, he made a huge impact to the world of psychology and spiritual thinking as well. That said, Jung did not consider himself a mystic by any stretch. It wasn't really his remit to guide people to individuation other than through psychotherapy. So he worked extensively one-on-one with patients, people with neuroses, who came with mental problems, disorders, and he helped them to straighten them out, to figure out what the conflict was and resolve them. But he wasn't concerned with anything beyond that. And I sense that this is actually a slight conflict in Jung's own life, and partly the reason for his split from Freud was that Jung was onto something here. He knew that the study of psychology was so much more than firefighting people's neuroses and conflicts. I think he got that actually it wasn't just something you did with a therapist, but that individuation was a way of life, that there are encounters in life that appear no matter what we do, rites of passage that need to be overcome, but also that outside of just therapy, what we choose to do day to day is what affects our mind. It is what either leads to neuroses or leads away from neuroses to straighten out the mind and towards living a life without conflict. So within the realm of psychology is certainly understanding, an intellectual understanding of the mind and of the psyche, including an understanding of the unconscious mind. In practice, that is inseparable from what we then do with that knowledge. Because what we then do with that knowledge is going to determine whether we move towards individuation or whether we stay stuck, resisting change, suffering from all the chronic problems that we're facing in today's society. So in contrast to psychology, there is, of course, religion and the exoteric traditions, at least, they do teach a way of life. And if someone practices that way of life, practicing generosity, speaking the truth, perhaps praying, meditating, they're going to see benefits to their mind up to a point, probably some quite significant benefits. But these traditions do not include an understanding of the unconscious. They provide a way of engaging with the unconscious mind, but they do that without realizing that that is what they're doing. So they confuse the map for the territory, in short, and tend to lean towards absolutism. And so that's why, whilst it can take a person to a point, it can't take them beyond that. And actually, the point to which absolutist religion can take a person's consciousness is nowhere near sufficient for navigating the complexities of the world today. That's where materialism comes in, solves a few of those problems, creates a whole bunch more. And so that's why now we have this new set of problems associated with that way of life or that viewpoint, and why individuation as a concept is now coming back on the scene and something we really ought to be looking at and consciously pursuing in our own lives. So whilst psychology is mainly concerned with understanding the mind and a bit of firefighting here and there, individuation is truly not possible without not just understanding, but also conduct, like how we actually embody that understanding in daily life. And then, of course, mental discipline. So this is how we actually train our mind, how we practice awareness, and also through dedicated practice, such as in meditation or even prayer, if you want to keep it within a religious context. So these are what I would consider to be the three main cornerstones of any spiritual practice. That is understanding, but not just surface level, not just scriptural knowledge, but actually understanding the unconscious mind and taking an idealist perspective on our experience here. Secondly, conduct in daily life. Thirdly, mental discipline. These are all essential. So the first one, understanding, is really the remit of psychology, and numbers 2 and 3, conduct and mental discipline, have really been the remit of religion. And so to actually walk the path of individuation, we need to combine all three of these. So spiritual traditions provide a system for improving the state of your mind. That is true. And it's a benefit that we lose when we throw them out completely in the name of science. But in the absence of understanding individuation and the unconscious mind, religious practices can come to be seen as rules of behavior, perhaps punished by the wrath of God or something like that. And what Jung psychology helps us to see is that these are not rules to be followed or to be broken, but to be understood. So unless we can actually develop understanding, we're not going to move forward. We're just going to be following rules, meeting specification. And of course, that's never going to work in this world, which is always changing, where real life situations require us to call on both aspects of our consciousness, right? We need to call on the need to be kind, but also the need to actually push back sometimes. And so it's not about being aggressive. It's not about being nicey-nicey. It's about finding that middle way all the time. And so the challenge with rules is that they don't allow us to find a middle way. And there's always going to be exceptions to those rules. It's just necessarily true. As long as we see them as rules, life will find a way to present situations that test us and require us to bend and break those rules, but in a way that's skillful and resolves it. So individuation, therefore, is not merely something you do with your therapist, with your coach, or with a spiritual leader. It is a way of life, and it permeates every decision we make and all aspects of our being. And this is really the part that psychology in its modern form misses currently. Now, it's understandable why that is, because psychology has come about through the materialist paradigm. It's come from that place. It is bridging that gap. But more and more, you see people quietly leaving that paradigm. Certainly physicists, for example, neuroscientists, psychologists, but maybe doing it in a way that kind of bolts on some of these idealist principles. And what I'm saying is actually maybe we just need to go, hey, you know what, there's this whole other paradigm here. Maybe actually we need to be looking at the mind itself rather than just incorporating psychology into a materialist paradigm. To be going, hang on a second, maybe we need to be looking at the mind directly and understanding how we can actually straighten out our minds. So now to a quote from Michael Tsarian. He says, "The average person may experience approximately 7 major rites of passage during their lives. The awakened person can have more, while a symbolically literate, self-realized person's life may be considered one continuous rite of passage." Now, he's actually talking about the divination arts here, particularly tarot, and how the tarot delineates, marks out a number of these rites of passage. But I think the point here is quite relevant to what I'm saying, in that when you actually consciously walk down the path of individuation, it's very curious how the world unfolds to you. You start to notice synchronicities almost constantly. And every encounter, every challenge is seen as something to be resolved and as a reflection of an inner conflict, something yet to be learned in yourself. And it is actually one's own inner conflict, lack of knowing, that in some way brought this situation about, and brought it about in a way that forced you to face the conflict. So it doesn't mean we're suddenly going to stop experiencing news of wars happening on the other side of the world, or we're not going to see rudeness anymore. Certainly those things will start to decrease, but it means that we're no longer going to experience them in a way that is directly pointing to our own inner conflict and forcing us, challenging us to face it, resolve it somehow. So just want to bring this all together and sort of just check in with where we are right now. In the first episode, I talked about materialism and materialist society and how it leaves out an engagement with the unconscious mind. It's essentially as though it just doesn't recognize it at all. There's no such thing as the unconscious. What I see is what there is. The way to create a good life is just to manipulate the environment, wrangle with the world, create the right systems, the right technology, the right set of values, get everyone to agree on that permanently, and we're good, right? So that's pretty much the view of materialist society. Then in the second episode, I talked about religion and how that leaves out rational thought. So whilst it engages with the unconscious, it doesn't understand the unconscious and assumes that what it is experiencing is something literal that exists out there in the world. And that's extremely limiting, especially as the world opens up and as different religions encounter each other, creates inevitable conflict, as these various groups of people essentially appear to agree on the same things, like whether it's practicing kindness, whether it's practicing generosity, but because they disagree on who the real savior was and which book contains the truth and this kind of thing, they have this irreconcilable conflict. So at a certain stage in human development, their beliefs were very useful. But as things opened up, they clashed with other people's beliefs who, even though in principle they actually do agree on things that are conducive to wholeness of mind to a degree, like they can't get along with each other. And actually, as a result of that, there's always things left out. There's always this absolutism that makes it impossible to work in the world in a dynamic way. So it may be more or less useful, it may be helpful enough up to a point, but there's always going to be circumstances where the rules don't apply or can't apply or actually do more harm than good. And now bringing it back to today, I'm talking about mostly psychology and how that completely leaves out this way of life aspect, including wholesome conduct and how we can actually use our decisions in daily life to integrate our mind. So even though that's something that is included in materialism to a point, so like the laws of society, it's included in religion to a point, the 10 Commandments, right? This kind of thing. The challenge is that by leaving something critical out of the equation, no one of these three views or these three approaches is able to even complete its own remit effectively. So, for example, in the case of materialism, by leaving out this understanding of the unconscious, it's questionable how rational their thinking really is. And it's also questionable how wholesome the conduct of society really is. Because even though we have certain ideas of what we think is good behavior, it's quite different from wholesome behavior, right? It's quite different from behavior that is conducive to eliminating internal conflict. So generally speaking, right, certain laws like around, say, stealing, for example, if we go around stealing, that's not going to be very conducive to integrating our mind. But actually, on a larger scale, it's quite clear that materialist society is not beyond a point moving us towards individuation. Hence why we have all the challenges I've mentioned: codependency, the chronic disease, the economic turmoil, and so on. And now, in the case of religion, in leaving out rational thought, it's questionable how well that actually engages with the unconscious mind. So whilst it certainly provides, or has provided, an invaluable way of engaging with it, it does that without really knowing that that is what it's doing. And likewise, when it comes to wholesome conduct, well, in the absence of rational thought, the wholesome conduct falls apart as well, right? And that's why we have, holy war and great animosity between religions. And in the case of psychology, by leaving out the understanding of what kind of behavior is conducive to individuation, it actually limits itself in its ability to engage with the unconscious and to actually think rationally. So rather than actually thinking in a way that's helpful, it tends to get very intellectual and make the entire pursuit of individuation pretty much an academic exercise. And so it's really when we combine all three of these aspects, that's rational thought and engagement with the deepest parts of ourselves, and thirdly, living by that understanding and that engagement, that's when a person can really engage with the individuation process to the extent needed in the kind of world we have today, where we're moving towards a very complex global society. So I'm going to highlight a number of ways in which we see the symptoms of this showing up. So where perhaps a person is very bought into not just a materialist perspective, but maybe even a religion, maybe even a spiritual path, maybe even some kind of psychological school of thought, but where they lack a way of life and a life practice, we see this showing up in ways that are quite contrary to the individuation process. Some of these I've touched on already. So, for example, attempting to individuate solely through coaching or therapy or at spiritual meetups, meditation groups, this kind of thing, or going to church. Individuation is not merely something you can partition to an hour or two a week. It is the result of what we do moment to moment. Lacking wholesome intentions. Okay, so this is a huge one. One of the greatest ironies you might see when you go to meditation groups and so on is actually a surprising lack of genuine compassion and empathy. There's a lot of anger, there's a lot of people trying to outdo each other. Of course, there's a lot of genuine compassion as well, but for something that is so crucial to the individuation process, it is something that is very worthy of pointing out. You see this very much in the coaching world as well. So coaching, where true empathy and compassion are absolutely essential to achieving a beneficial result for both parties. Quite often coaches who don't understand the individuation process or don't understand that it is a way of life will go into an interaction not actually trying to help the person, but actually trying to get one up on them somehow. And, when you're coming at it from a materialist paradigm, that can sort of make more sense because, if everything's material, then great, we get one up on the world and we've won, right? We've come away better. But that's not how existence really works. If we try to get one up on someone or get one up on the world somehow, there will be a consequence one way or another. And we won't necessarily know where that consequence is going to come, but it will come. And if we're not practicing genuine compassion in our interactions, we are by necessity cheating on our capacity for genuine connection and the ability to actually facilitate the growth of others. Another symptom that's very common these days is emotional manipulation in all of its forms. And this again is a symptom of the materialist paradigm. It's a symptom of just trying to get the world, including other people, to behave the way we want them to, right? And this can include coldness or just kind of not responding appropriately. So, if someone says hi to us, we might say hi in return. It's quite simple stuff, right? But if we're trying to sort of get one up on them, we might actually just blank them or just, give them a response that's kind of not in the middle. That can also apply to really excessive responses, right? If we say hi to someone and they respond with just this effusive kind of oh my God, how are you doing? That's way over the top, right? So it's all about finding that middle ground. And this is not about expectation of, I want people to respond to me in a certain way. This is about what is conducive to wholeness of mind. And that is not coldness, it's not rudeness, because if we're doing these things, then there's something we're pushing away necessarily. You see emotional manipulation show up in the form of hot and cold behavior. So, if people are very, very friendly with someone 1 minute or one day, and the next time they see them, they're really, really cold. And this isn't always done consciously, and often it is done consciously, and it's a form of gaslighting, right? It's a way of trying to remove other people from their center because one doesn't feel centered in themselves and because they don't value the pursuit of individuation and moving towards self-sovereignty. They have on some level decided that they're going to placate their own lack of self-sovereignty by trying to get it out of other people, by trying to get that attention and validation from other people. And so, rather than actually, okay, let's have a mutually beneficial interaction and relationship and grow together, I'm going to, use this person by decentering them so that I don't have to feel what I don't want to feel. So at that point in time, that person has decided to, rather than resolve their conflict, to push it away, placate it, and hope that it goes away, essentially, which of course it can't, not unless it's resolved and seen and straightened out in the conscious mind. We see this in the act of ghosting, right? This is essentially just, you've had an interaction with someone, you've had a relationship, whether it be short term or long term, maybe had something that resembled connection, at least to perhaps the other person or yourself. And then you decide, for one reason or another, I'm not interested, or they reflect something in me that I'm not comfortable with. I'm just going to ghost them. I'm just going to disappear off the face of the earth. This is very easy to do in this day and age, right? You can just unfriend them on Facebook. You can just block them on Instagram. You can just, block their number and so on. And of course, if we've subscribed to the materialist paradigm, why wouldn't you ghost someone, right? Hey, it makes me feel better, at least in the short term. As far as I'm concerned, they're the problem, because when I feel pain around them, that means they're the problem, right? So I just delete them and bish bash bosh, pain is gone. Well, of course, this is not the way one truly solves their problems. This is taking the expedient way out as a way to not actually take responsibility for one's own mind, not practicing understanding, not looking at why this issue showed up, what this reflects about my own mind, and what unresolved conflicts this is actually pointing to. So if ever we feel ourselves tempted to just push someone out of our lives, it's a golden opportunity to actually look at our own mind, to practice taking responsibility for our mind and move towards that self-knowledge that we've been talking about. Another symptom of lacking a life practice is with a spiritual persona. So this is actually very common, and it's understandable why, because our psyche aspires to wholeness, it aspires to reach its full potential, and often the easiest way to meet and fulfill that drive is to do something that merely looks like spirituality. One way this shows up is, like, if you go to a spiritual meetup and so on, people try to out-teach each other, right? So it looks like spirituality, it looks like wisdom, but actually it's a way to not have to step out of the ego, not have to actually take on board new information and change one's views and understanding. Or, they might speak up and share their knowledge as though it looks like they're being helpful, but really the motivation is to look good, and to look good as a way of fulfilling a spiritual persona. And this is essentially a way of adapting to the world with its roots in childhood, just like any persona. It's formed as an adaptation to early childhood conditions usually, and throughout one's early life and then going into adult life, it's morphed and changed into a kind of spiritual persona. But more broadly, this is a persona that is just better than other people in some way, but does so in a way that appears humble. So it kind of fulfills these two conflicting desires, right? Like, I want to be seen as humble, but I also want to be better than other people and wise. And so one adopts this spiritual persona as a way to placate that underlying conflict, rather than face the fear of not being advanced, not being ahead of everyone else and this kind of thing. Like, what does that feel like? Can we go there? Can we really work through that feeling? You let go of that and it's like, okay, I don't have to actually try and look spiritual anymore. I can just show up authentically. And so another symptom of this lack of practice shows up in all forms of signaling, not just the spiritual persona, but any kind of persona, whether it's being kind or being competent or being funny, whatever it is, like needing to be seen a certain way. And from one perspective, loosening our grip on the persona is one of the primary steps on this path of individuation. Letting go of the way we've become conditioned to see ourselves, the way we want to be seen by other people, integrating the shadow, so letting go of the fears of being seen as the opposite of the persona. This is absolutely key. And if everyone just did that one thing, the world would be transformed massively, right? So letting go of the need to signal, dropping hints around who you are, your achievements, your attainments, this kind of thing. You're saying like, I'm not saying I'm Jesus, but, in my past life, I was a religious leader who was murdered, and I now have marks on certain parts of my body associated with that death. Cut all that out. Like, it doesn't matter if people don't think that about you. Like, what would be so bad about being, seen as unkind or aggressive or, unspiritual or unevolved? Really, what would be the tragedy? And can we face up to that feeling and let that go? Likewise, preaching or giving unsolicited advice or sending spam, right? Like, we've adopted this way of life or this particular sect of pop spirituality, or we're following this particular spiritual influencer on Instagram, and now everyone else needs to hear this advice. It's been so helpful to me that it must be true, and therefore everyone else needs to see it. And everyone I know who still has problems, unlike me, they now need to hear the advice that helped me, right? Does this sound familiar? So this is preaching, and this is very much in line with the materialist way of operating that sort of says, okay, we'll just find the right method or the right system, and then we'll impose that. The alternative is to understand that actually, what's really true is what's underneath and what gives rise to all of what we see. And therefore, it's not that Christianity is wrong or Islam is wrong. It's about what they represent that's underneath. And truly understanding that everybody can and has to find their own way. Not because, they're less evolved than us, or because they just don't understand what we understand, but because they genuinely have a completely different experience of reality. And their approach of getting to truth is literally no less valid than our own. It's about really getting to the understanding of that. And that can really only come when we start taking responsibility for our mind and penetrating into the true nature of things. In other words, that what we are experiencing is our mind and is an output of mind, not a external reality made of material being experienced directly. Another way this shows up is through arrogance, and I would attach to that swagger, right? Or trying to portray a persona of competence. This is a particularly insidious one because culturally in the West, this is something we actually tend to value. So arrogance and swagger and competence are part of the cultural persona. So if you move in Western circles and you're working with Western spiritual teachers and coaches and therapists, you're less likely to have this spotted. You're less likely to recognize that there may be a kind of arrogance in the persona, and also to actually see why that might be an obstacle to your spiritual growth. Because we tend to laud competence and arrogance and ego or conceit in the Western culture, because we believe these are the ways to get things done, to build these systems, right? So that we can have a good life for ourselves. But we don't so easily see the challenges that this actually causes at the same time, as well as the systems those things create and how it does so in place of actually reflecting and bringing on board unseen aspects of ourselves. So there's almost no better way really to advertise your lack of wholesome intentions when helping somebody or when coaching somebody than to show up with swagger and arrogance, right? You're sending a message there that says, I'm better than you, and I would rather remain better than you in my mind, so that way I don't have to feel bad. I'd rather that you felt bad, that you felt like the second-class citizen here. Now, it's really quite clear how damaging that is, and yet it remains mostly unquestioned in Western society. So, I think it's quite important to point that one out. So another symptom of lacking a life practice, being excessively up, feeling like we have to be up all the time, this excitability, right? Mania, hyperactivity. These, again, are traits that we tend to associate with getting things done, moving forward in the world, achievement. And the irony is, of course, what you don't achieve with these things is integration of mind. It's a peaceful mind, and it's the ability to actually work effectively. Not least because these are one-sided aspects of consciousness. It's not possible to be hypermanic or hyperactive all the time. You see this in manic depression, for example, another symptom of modern society and culture. This feeling like we need to be up all the time. We talk about maintaining a peak state. There's a contradiction in terms. And when we don't want to be seen as down, when we have frustrations with people, we might turn to passive aggression, because the last thing we'd do, or the last thing we'd like to do, is to give any sign that things aren't quite right in ourselves, that we're not up. I also list here mandatory smiling, right? Like if you're not smiling, there must be something bad or wrong going on. And therefore, just make sure you smile all the time, and therefore all your problems will be gone. Now, I'm a fan of smiling, but I certainly am not a fan of smile police. I don't think that's the way to individuation. But then likewise, being excessively down, right? So there's always a case for allowing emotions to flow through us, right? To face up to feelings is absolutely critical and often overlooked. But that's different from being excessively down and dwelling in our anger, right? Moving towards anger and grumpiness as a way to placate something or hide something from ourselves. It's not that being angry is bad, but if we're using anger as a way to not go near our conflicts, then that is not conducive to individuation. Likewise, wallowing in self-pity under the guise perhaps of self-compassion. Oh, I'm practicing self-compassion. I'm being kind to myself. Okay, that's great, but not if you're doing it as a cover for self-pity, so that you, again, don't actually face up to the hidden emotion or the hidden feeling. I've also listed here what I call my way is right thinking. And for those of you who are familiar with spiral dynamics, I would relate this to tier 1 thinking. If you don't know what that means yet, that's absolutely fine. I'm actually going to be producing content in the future about spiral dynamics. But in summary, what this means is that where we are at in our journey and development, whatever solutions appear to be solving our current problems appear to be working for us, and then we assume that that is therefore what those around us need, not least our immediate circle, but maybe the organizations we work for, and maybe even society as a whole. So this might show up in a number of ways. The most apparently highbrow way in which this might show up is in thinking that everyone just needs to be kind to each other. Everyone just needs to be nice to each other. I mean, why didn't I think of that, right? Of course, I do believe that being kind to other people is essential for self-realization. But if we expect everyone else to be kind to us and think that our own kindness is a kind of panacea to the unwholesomeness in others, we're going to meet some pretty heavy-duty challenges as a result of that, which force us then to integrate those aspects of ourselves. Likewise, thinking that something just creates results in the world, thinking that it improves the bottom line, thinking that it makes money for us, that therefore it must be right? It must be the way of doing things. Well, we need not look very far to see the problems that's caused. What about absolutist thinking? What about thinking that because my religion works for me, because I found truth in my holy book, that therefore it must be the truth and everyone else needs to think along those lines. If they disagree with me, they must be wrong because I've had such profound religious experiences. And lastly, what I would think of as just raw selfish pragmatism, taking what one wants, acting ruthlessly, being cunning, using deception, these kinds of things, backed by a rationale kind of no more complex than, oh, well, it gets results for me. And if I don't do it, someone else will. Well, here's an idea. Maybe you're in that kind of environment because that's how you think, right? Maybe actually the true pragmatism is to look at what would be best if everyone behaved that way. This is not wishful thinking. This is not about saying, oh, if only everyone just was nice to each other, right? To go back to that example. But it's understanding that in order to actually integrate ourselves and create genuine value, we need to be setting an example, and we can't just be playing zero-sum games. There's no wisdom in saying, oh, well, it's a zero-sum game, therefore just work with it as it is and get ahead, in full knowledge that getting ahead puts someone else behind. Maybe you haven't chosen a great game if that's the kind of job you're working, for example. Another symptom of lacking practice is vague and magical thinking. So this might be having some engagement with the unconscious mind, but not thinking about it rationally and not practicing a way of life that helps you engage with it as though it was your own mind. So, this is making spurious links between events, reveling in how amazing and cool and mysterious they are, but failing to actually extract the lesson that leads to reduced conflict in oneself. Also, intellectualizing, right? So quite common in psychology. It's like we've got this fantastic model of mind. We really understand the mind. We understand all the archetypes. We understand, the process of individuation, how it unfolds, and the hero's journey, and all of this. That's great, but we need to be embodying that. We need to be actually living our life in line with that. Applying rational thought, yes, but also actually engaging with the unconscious mind and practicing the other cornerstones, ethical conduct and mental discipline. Another symptom, obsession with materiality. For example, food or perfume, clothes, drugs, etc. Now, I'm not saying any of these things are bad. We all need to eat, right? We all need to wear clothes. We might all need to take medicine from time to time. I'm talking about a reliance on these things as a way to regulate unresolved feeling and unresolved conflict. So it's all good to enjoy a good meal, but it's another thing to be addicted to food or to rely on food as a way to manage your feelings at the end of a stressful working day and allow that to become a habit. So, it's great to appreciate these nice things when they come around, but it's not overstepping the mark and coming to rely on them and allow them to become attachments, whereby if you don't have them, you feel painful feelings, you suffer in some way, you get upset, you get stressed, you feel bored, this kind of thing. And lastly, this is an interesting one. Aversion or lack of awareness to symbolism. So this very much harks back to understanding that what we experience is our mind and that mind is the forerunner to matter, idealism, right? And that symbolism is the language of the psyche, and that when we consciously move down this path of spiritual growth, our experiences in daily life in the apparent material world will unfold to us in a curiously symbolic way. And having that openness to understand what it is the mind is telling us is key to moving down that path. But if we just dismiss it and just say, it doesn't mean anything, it's just coincidence, we're not going to get the message. We're not going to draw any meaning or lessons from that situation. Some would argue there's been an active movement to suppress symbolic literacy in the world. I'm personally undecided on that, but I certainly agree that becoming symbolically literate and looking for the meaning in our experiences is a very valuable exercise, and that having a lack of awareness of symbolism is indicative of a kind of materialist viewpoint, that it's just stuff, it doesn't mean anything, and all I need to do is configure that stuff and then I'll be fine. So in my own spiritual practice, in my own attempts to make sense of all of this and combine what I was learning in psychology and understanding of the unconscious mind with practices I'd learned in Buddhism and from my own spiritual practice over 20 years, I compiled what I call the 7 Habits of Individuation. And so this is really like the way of life that makes the unconscious conscious. And so it expands upon the understanding of Jung and psychology and brings in aspects of ethical conduct and mental discipline that spiritual traditions tended to excel at, but maybe left out that understanding of the unconscious mind. So the 7 habits are my best attempt to deconstruct and consolidate the most effective spiritual practices from people I've known, multiple spiritual teachers, coaches, psychologists that I've worked with, and from my reading of spiritual texts and psychology, and like I said, from my own spiritual practice over the years. So this is not something I've just cobbled together as a way to create a compelling blog post. This is the subject of a lot of thinking and a lot of iteration. And hey, it's a work in progress, and I'm always open to feedback, things you think might have been left out that you found useful, things that you think are maybe overemphasized. Always interested to hear that. I will say that I have chucked this through many iterations, whittled it down to what I feel are the 7 most important things to practice when it comes to moving oneself towards spiritual growth. And so the 7 habits are the way of making the unconscious conscious. So it's not merely about saying, oh, just be kind to people because, then you'll get good results and they'll be kind to you. Like, that's all good and well, but it's really about understanding not only what works for spiritual growth, but why it works. And by incorporating this understanding of the unconscious mind, we can really get to understand why certain behaviors work and move us towards wholeness, and why other behaviors are conducive to separation. So it's not about being good versus being bad. That's very subjective. It's about what is conducive to reducing psychological conflict. And since how we relate to the world is a reflection of our minds, we can use the 7 habits to get to work on our mind through how we interact with the world. So these are not rules to be followed. There's nothing absolutist here, but they are guidelines to be understood. And if you understand them, you can use them however you need to. You can incorporate them into your own practice and apply them to your own unique mind and situation. So the idea of the 7 habits is to guide you in facing up to all aspects of the unconscious, both in daily life and in dedicated training sessions. So that's meditation daily, but also things like active imagination. For some people, it might be prayer, but the important thing is that we're including this dedicated training session as well as applying these concepts in daily life. Overall, they make life better, right? That's the elevator pitch right there. Doing these habits will make your life better. Need I say more? No, they do straighten out the mind a lot. If you practice these habits, you will experience a lot more peace. You'll find making decisions a lot easier. You'll feel a lot less agitated. You'll be able to find your words more easily. You'll find your relationships improve. Look, I'm not here to pitch the benefits of spiritual practice, but I would just emphasize that whatever challenges you have, I would make the case that you can map those to something in the 7 habits. You can find the origin of those problems somewhere in the 7 habits. By not practicing something in the 7 habits, that will give rise to some kind of conflict. And therefore, any solution to those can also be found in the 7 habits. And that's not to say that you must follow these in some absolutist way. That's not what we're going for here. These are a map for you to use as works for you as a way to attain your own self-sovereignty. Now, there might be a case for saying, hey, you know what? I'm just going to hang out with these habits for a while. I'm going to apply them. I'm not going to subscribe to them dogmatically, but maybe try them out for a month, see what happens. And then over time, you can adapt as necessary. So in brief then, the 7 habits of individuation are: habit 1, take responsibility for your mind. Now, quite straightforward that, but there is a lot in that simple phrase. Yes, it's a practice, but it also pertains to understanding and is rooted in the understanding that we are responsible for our mind and we can take responsibility for our mind. And actually, as we practice all these habits, that map, that idea of, okay, take responsibility for my mind, that starts to become the territory. You start to see this with your own direct experience. And so within this habit, I would also include the understanding of mind, the understanding that what we experience is our mind, and that actually this is empirically true. We know this to be true. Even the things we see, the things we taste, the pain, the meaning we experience, it's all our mind. And so if we really want to solve our challenges, we want to start here. We want to take responsibility for our mind, work on the mind directly, and understand we're not merely fixing the world. We can address the world. Ultimately, we are working with the world as a way to get back to our mind, to work with our mind. Habit 2 is to cultivate wholesome intentions. So this means setting the intention to look at our unconscious mind, to build on habit 1, understand that there are things we don't see, and that when faced with the option, we want to move towards making the unconscious conscious. As part of doing that, we also set the intention to let go of what we crave, what we become reliant on materially, the things we're attached to, substances, people, ideas. We can still engage with all these things, but just not to be reliant on them, like psychically reliant on them. And also, cultivating wholesome intentions means cultivating the intention to love, and that includes compassion and sympathetic joy, and to move away from anger and discord. So those first 2 habits pertain to understanding. That's the wisdom component, if you like. And then moving into habit 3, this is now in the realm of conduct in daily life. So habit 3 is skillful communication. That means speaking what is true, speaking what is purposeful, so not with craving, and speaking what is kind, so not with hatred or anger or with pushing things away. And that, of course, applies to all forms of communication, not just the way we talk, but the way we write, the way we type, the way we text, the way we post on social media, and so on. Habit 4 is to contribute your unique and specific value. So this is about livelihood. This is about knowing your unique set of facts on one hand and contributing value in a way that is authentic to that. But it's also about contributing in a way that is aligned to what the world actually needs of you. And so, it's essential that we do contribute something, because we all need to take something from the world, and we can only really justify that if we're also contributing. And so if we're not contributing, but we are taking, we're going to create a lot of internal conflict. Habit 5 is to manage your state. So this means using energy to maintain wholesome states of mind and abolish unwholesome states of mind, doing that proactively, doing that in response to what is happening in the moment. And it also means configuring and constructing our life in a way that is conducive to wholeness of mind. So it's not about trying to make ourselves feel a certain way by creating a nice environment, but it's about understanding that that is a worthy exercise as a way to achieve that state of wholeness. And that also that our environment is actually a reflection of our minds. So, if we are living in an untidy place, then, it's telling us something about our own mind. Habit 6 is mindfulness all day, every day. This involves present moment awareness. It involves recognizing what is going on in the mind, knowing that. It means applying bare attention to what is happening. So being conscious of the direct, raw experience. This is really important for feelings, for example, as well as physical sensations. And it also means practicing clear comprehension of causes and consequences. So knowing why we're doing what we're doing, knowing what has led to the situation we're in, and knowing how what we're doing in the present moment is going to produce results in the future. Habit 7 is meditate daily. And this, in the context of the 7 habits, means a dedicated, independent training session for the mind where we devote our entire focus to making the unconscious conscious. So meditation is really a dedicated practice. It's not something we can do whilst driving. It's not something we can do at the gym. It really requires that dedicated, undivided focus as a way to straighten out the mind in a way that we can't do in daily life, and to a level beyond what we can achieve in daily life alone. So I'm going to go into far greater depth in each of these in future episodes, but here's just an overview. Another thing you might want to know is that you can actually download an audio program of the 7 Habits at makeitconscious.com, and it should be quite easy to find there where to go to actually download that program. Just to say a bit more about the habits, they work in 2 primary ways. So yes, on one hand, they are a practice. So in adhering to the habits, you will serve to integrate the mind. It creates and responds to opportunities for integration. At the same time, though, they also act as an indicator of what is going on in the mind. You can think of this as like the warning light on the dashboard of your mind. So where we find ourselves struggling to adhere to the 7 habits, it's telling us something about our mind that we wouldn't otherwise be able to see. So for example, if we find ourselves compelled to tell a white lie, what does that mean for us? Why is that, right? Or if we find ourselves wishing harm on another person, then it's compelling us to look back at our own mind and understand what it is about our own mind that is giving rise to those unwholesome intentions. So it works as both the practice and a kind of indicator as to what is going on in our mind. And actually, that is also a way of us coming to understand the role of the unconscious. It's like, if we say a Freudian slip, for example, we didn't consciously plan to say that Freudian slip, but it came out anyway. So, we're getting familiar here with the workings of the unconscious. The clue's in the name, right? Unconscious. So there's so much going on behind the scenes that we're simply not aware of. And in using the 7 habits as an indicator, it's actually also helping us become more and more familiar with the workings of the unconscious, of aspects of our mind that we were previously unaware of. So as I said, a lot of thought has gone into these habits. The inspiration has come from 3 primary sources. The first is the people I've known, spiritual teachers, psychologists, coaches, mentors. I feel very privileged to have worked with many people I would consider to be highly integrated and on the path of individuation. Secondly, it's come from my reading of psychology and the various spiritual traditions. I spent a long time studying Buddhism. And thirdly, from my own personal spiritual practice and figuring out what's worked for me to resolve my own conflicts and life challenges, I regard my personal spiritual practice as having started over 20 years ago. Now, from one perspective, our entire life is a spiritual growth journey, right? So where to draw the line? Well, for me, it's the day that I became consciously aware that I was pursuing a journey of spiritual growth. And that's marked by a day when I went into a bookstore curious about these topics and came out with a book on Qigong. And I did practice the exercises, but it was really the meditation exercises in that book that really made their mark. And so I started practicing meditation very soon after and immediately found some very beneficial results from that. Put it on the back burner for a number of years, got back into meditation again about 8 or 9 years ago, but I think it's fair to say in the time in between, I was still nonetheless pursuing a spiritual path, but I became reacquainted with the importance of meditation and just how valuable, vital even, some kind of daily mental training session is for the mind. So there you go, guys. That has been a talk on why individuation is a way of life, not merely something you do with your psychologist or your coach or your therapist. It is something that permeates every moment of every day. And if we're going to consciously pursue spiritual growth, as I think we need to as a society in order to actually resolve many of our challenges, then this is something we need to be incorporating into our lives more holistically. And as part of this, I've introduced you to the 7 Habits of Individuation, which I will be expanding upon in further episodes. But for now, I will leave that there. I hope you found that useful, and I shall speak with you next time.